Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Orszag, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. I'll give a brief overview, and then I will turn it over to my colleague, Christy Romer, who's the Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, to describe in a bit more detail the economics behind the fiscal year 2011 budget, which we are releasing this morning. That fiscal year 2011 budget focuses on three things: job creation, middle-class security, and putting the nation back on a path to fiscal sustainability. Before turning to the details of the budget, let me just give a little bit of context and background. We just came through a year in which a second Great Depression was averted. At the end of 2008, real GDP was declining by more than 5% on an annualized basis. At the end of 2009, it was increasing by more than 5% on an annualized basis. Although real GDP and the economy is now expanding, the employment market remains too weak. The unemployment rate is 10%, and there are now 7 million fewer jobs than in December 2007. That's why this budget includes important investments to spur job creation now, including the jobs and wages tax credit that the President spoke about last week, and including key investments in the drivers of longer-term economic growth, education, innovation, and moving towards a clean energy future. Now let's also do a little bit of background and context on the budget. In January 2009, the situation that was apparent at that point involved two key features that are still the case. One was a significant increase in spending from 2008 to 2009, and the second was significant out-year deficits. Both of those were already apparent before the administration took office. In particular, on the first case, in January 2009, several weeks before the administration took office, the Congressional Budget Office issued an economic and budget outlook. That economic and budget outlook showed an increase in spending as a share of the economy from 20.9% in fiscal year 2008 to 24.9% in 2009. The reality actually came in slightly lower than that, 24.7%, but the point was, in a slightly different mix, less mandatory spending, more discretionary spending, the point was that significant increase in spending as a share of the economy was already apparent at the end of 2008 and early 2009. Second, we also faced not only a 2009 deficit that was in excess of $1.3 trillion, but a medium-term deficit in excess of $8 trillion. And that came from two primary sources. The first was a set of policies, the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts and the Medicare prescription drug benefit, that had not been paid for. That amounts to almost $6 trillion with added interest costs over the next decade because those policies were not offset. And second, the effects of the economic downturn amounted to about $2.5 trillion because when the economy weakens, tax revenue declines and certain types of spending automatically increase. Those automatic stabilizers, again, added about $2.5 trillion to the projected deficit over the decade. Now, that is an explanation of the situation in which we found ourselves and in which we continue to find ourselves, but it does not explain the path forward. So what in particular are we doing to bring the deficit down from roughly 10% of the economy in 2009? Several things. The first step is to make sure you don't dig the hole deeper. We are particularly pleased that the Senate has now joined the House in embracing a proposal that the administration embraces, so-called statutory pay-as-you-go legislation. That is to embed in law the common sense principle that any new proposals or new tax cuts need to be offset so that they don't cause a deterioration in the budget deficit. If we had lived by this simple principle over the past several years, we would be facing out-year deficits that would be roughly 2% of the economy, and debt as a share of the economy would be declining rather than rising. Second, the economic recovery, which will ultimately take hold, will help to reduce the deficit from about 10% of the economy down to about 5% of the economy by 2015, because tax revenue will recover and those automatic stabilizers on the spending side will also decline. Our goal is roughly 3% of the economy, which would balance the budget, excluding interest payments on the debt. To get from 5 to 3, we have a series of proposals. The first is that we put forward specific steps to reduce the deficit over the next decade by $1.2 trillion, which would move us from 5% of the economy in 2015 to 4%. These steps include measures such as the financial services fee, which raises $90 billion over a decade, helps to repay taxpayers for the full cost of TARP, and also by imposing the tax on our largest financial institutions, helps to discourage the leverage that was partly the cause of the financial meltdown that we have experienced. Second, we allow the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts to expire for those with incomes above $250,000 in 2011 and thereafter, as scheduled under the legislation. That reduces the deficit by almost $700 billion over the next decade. Third, as part of our effort to move towards a clean energy future, we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, which reduces the deficit by about $40 billion over the next decade. And then in addition to all of that, we have a 3-year freeze on non-security discretionary spending, which will reduce the deficit by $250 billion. Now let me be very clear about this freeze. First, it is not across the board. Some agencies and programs are going up, and other agencies and programs are going down. In particular, we're investing an additional $3 billion in education, because that's one of the keys to future economic prosperity, even while we're reforming those programs. For example, taking 38 existing duplicative programs, consolidating them into 11, and putting more emphasis on results rather than just funding. Second, we are investing significantly in research and development, including more than $61 billion in fiscal year 2011, which is up 6%, because research and development and innovation are also key drivers of economic activity. And third, we are investing in clean energy, more than $6 billion to move towards the energy sources of the future, working in concert with the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies so that we can become the world's leader in green energy. All of these together move the deficit in 2015 to roughly 4% of the economy, which, as I've said, is above where we'd like to be. To get the rest of the way there will require a bipartisan process, which is why we are calling for a bipartisan fiscal commission, tasked not only with addressing our long-term fiscal imbalance, but also producing plans that will balance the budget, excluding interest payments on the debt, by 2015. Finally, let me note that all has to do with the deficit over the next decade, making key investments in job creation today, reducing the deficit by $1.2 trillion over the next decade, while investing in education, innovation, and clean energy. In addition to that set of challenges, we also face a long-term fiscal gap, which is driven primarily by healthcare costs. And one of the reasons why the administration has been so focused on comprehensive health reform legislation is that it would not only reduce the deficit over the next decade, but perhaps as importantly, or even more importantly, put in place the infrastructure and the policies that will help to constrain costs and improve quality in the decades thereafter. And unless we do that, we will continue to face a very substantial long-term fiscal gap. Thank you, and with that, I'll turn it over to Christy to go through our economic assumptions.
Well, thank you. As Peter suggested, I'm going to take just a few minutes to summarize the key economic assumptions underlying the fiscal 2011 budget. As you may know, the Council of Economic Advisors takes the lead in a process that includes the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Treasury to produce the administration forecast that goes into all of the budget projections. Our forecast was finalized back in mid-November, on November 17th, and so is based on data through the middle of November. Now, I should say right up front, as the professional forecasters in each of our offices who contribute to the forecast frequently say, we are economists and not soothsayers, and all forecasts have to be understood to be subject to substantial margins of error. And I would say, particularly in the wake of a severe downturn, such as we have been through, usual patterns surely provide less guidance than in more ordinary times. But we have certainly attempted to base the budget projections on our best estimate of what lies ahead. All right, well, first let me talk about our forecast for real GDP growth. And in this discussion, I'm going to focus on fourth quarter to fourth quarter percent changes, because I find these the most straightforward to interpret and to compare. So the administration forecasts growth of 3% in 2010, followed by growth of 4.3% in both 2011 and 2012. Now, our estimate of growth in 2010 is virtually identical to the consensus of private forecasters surveyed by the blue chip economic indicators, and is right smack in the middle of the central tendency of the Federal Reserve's Federal Open Market Committee forecast that was released back in November. Our medium-term forecasts are also within the range of the other forecasts, but I think here it's true there's substantial variation across the different forecasts. Now, this actually is shown in Chart 2.5 of the Analytical Perspectives volume. Our average annual GDP growth projection for the 5 years after the GDP trough is 3.8%, similar to the 4.2% historical average during recoveries. Now, the forecast that the Congressional Budget Office released last week was considerably more pessimistic about both 2010 and 2011 than either the administration forecast or the blue chip consensus. And actually, as CBO noted in its release, they're required to make forecasts under the assumption that none of the Recovery Act provisions are extended, there's no new jobs bill enacted, and all of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts expire at the end of the year. CBO's report was careful to explain that under the assumption that some of these policies will be extended, its forecast would have looked much more similar to other forecasts. All right, well, for the unemployment rate, the administration projects that we will end 2010 with an unemployment rate at approximately 9.8%. By the fourth quarter of 2011, it's projected to be 8.9%. And by the fourth quarter of 2012, 7.9%. These estimates are again in the range of other forecasts, both for the short and the medium run. Now, our projections of the unemployment rate reflect the particularly severe toll that this recession has taken on the labor market and on American workers. To counteract the painfully high rate of unemployment and to accelerate the recovery of the labor market, the President has called for a number of targeted actions to jumpstart private sector job creation. And among these is the Small Business Jobs and Wage Tax Credit that he announced just last week. Finally, let me say a word about the inflation rate, where here I'm going to focus on it measured using the GDP price index. We project that inflation will be 1% over the 4 quarters of 2010, 1.4% over 2011, and 1.7% over 2012. I'd say that these projections are lower than those of some forecasters and higher than others. The low levels of projected inflation reflect the effects of continued high levels of slack in the economy. Under these conditions, we see little risk of noticeably increased inflation. At the same time, inflationary expectations appear to be quite well anchored, and so we do not project rapid declines in inflation or deflation. The administration anticipates that the inflation rate will level off at about 1.8%, squarely within the Federal Reserve's long-run projection range of 1.7 to 2%. Well, there's certainly no question that the past year has been an incredibly difficult one for the American economy and for the American people. Because of the actions taken over the past year, the trajectory of the economy is greatly improved. As Peter mentioned, real GDP expanded strongly in the fourth quarter of 2009 and shows every sign of continuing to grow steadily. However, as our forecast makes clear, the path back to full employment will take time and continued vigilance. The President is committed to taking every responsible action to accelerate job creation and speed recovery. Thanks.
Okay, I think we will now open it up to questions. There are wireless microphones for folks asking questions, and I see lots of hands up over here, so why don't we start right there.
Real quick on the assumptions you had were frozen from November 17th.
Yes.
So did those that didn't include the fourth quarter, the 5.7 number that we got on Friday?
Absolutely not.
Okay, and then is that when you decided that you would have $100 billion in stimulus funds or job funds, excuse me, my mistake. I don't know why anyone would make that mistake. 100 billion, that is driving your forecasts for your 3% growth or not? You're not getting towards the House's version of 154 billion, or is what's the placeholder there?
So Peter can certainly, the placeholder in
I'll
the.
do the placeholder.
You want to do the placeholder?
But just to answer the question about locking down,
So yes, we certainly locked it down before we got the fourth quarter GDP number. I think if that's the question, yeah.
and then quickly on the placeholder, we have $100 billion in a jobs package that includes $33 billion or so for the new jobs and wages tax credit that the president talked about to spur small business hiring and increases in wages. And there will be other components forthcoming.
But that placeholder did influence the modeling that Dr. Romer has.
We anticipated that there would be some additional job activity in doing the economic assumptions.
And
yes.
it wouldn't vary it that much whether or not that number is 100 billion or 154 billion or close to the Senate's version.
Well, I also think you're comparing, just let me answer the question more directly. The House had 155 billion. That's not completely apples to apples with regard to our $100 billion placeholder. So be careful about jumping to conclusions about relative magnitudes there.
But we do, but the assumption that you guys have does include additional jobs money in the range of 100 billion.
Yes.
Does any of the projections in the budget, either for 2011 or in the outlying years, assume that, since you locked this down to the 17th, assume that some version of healthcare reform or even incremental healthcare reform, such as IT, would be signed into law?
Yeah, we took a very simple approach in which, since both the House and Senate had passed legislation, we took the average of the two, and you'll see in the tables the net deficit impact from taking the average of the House and Senate legislation. So I would note, for example, that's just slightly north over 10 years of $100 billion in deficit reduction. So it's a very small share of the more than $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction that's contained in the budget. And I further note that $1.2 trillion does not include the impact of winding down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you included that, you're well north of $2 trillion in deficit reduction.
Thank you. Jeff Mason from Reuters. My question is for Dr. Romer. Pardon me, I've got a cold. Can you explain a little bit about what's driving your optimism on GDP? You seem to be a little bit further than consensus on GDP, but in line with consensus on unemployment.
Oh, that's a great idea. So, are we on? Yes. So I think the first thing to say is, as you point out, we're smack equal to the consensus in 2010. For 2011, we're, again, within the range, say, that the FOMC put out in their November forecast. We are a little bit higher than the consensus. I think I do want to come back to historical experience, because certainly one of the things that I mentioned is coming out of past recessions, average growth in the 5 years after the GDP trough has been some 4.2%. We are actually, over that same 5-year period, our forecast has 3.8%, so we're certainly being, I think, very true to history, if anything, erring on slightly below the historical average. So, we think, based on what we're doing, the policies in place, what we see happening, we think it's a reasonable, honest forecast.
I remember last year, I think in this same room, you gave a forecast on unemployment that was a little bit more optimistic than some others were saying, and you indicated then that you had information or data that others weren't looking at. Do you have data or information that is driving your GDP forecast that others aren't looking at?
So certainly let me talk some about last year. Certainly last year, one of the things I was talking very much about is that we certainly we thought better assumptions about what the policies that we would put in place would be. I think the first thing to do is to acknowledge that, like many forecasters, certainly our unemployment forecast for last year was lower than has turned out to be. And that certainly, I think, reflects in large part just how, as I mentioned before, how severe this recession has been on the labor market in particular. And I'll say, one of the things that is also true, the behavior of unemployment has been unusual given the behavior of GDP. The last thing I can't help, since we've been pulling the numbers on this. When we got the fourth quarter number for GDP. We now know what actual GDP change was from the end of 2008 to the end of 2009. It was 0.1, 0.1%. Last year, we had, our forecast was for it to grow 0.3%. So we, in fact, were on the GDP forecast, I think, remarkably accurate. Just to give you some context, the blue chip at the same time was minus 1.5%.
That's an economist version of told you so. Let's go over there.
Coming after.
So the budget identifies the high priority performance goals that agencies submitted, but it doesn't say whether or not those goals will lead to an increase in funding for the agencies. Can you talk about whether you are proposing additional funding in the areas that agencies identified as important?
Yes, the high performance goals, which are new this year, were fed into the budget process and will continue to play a key role. We're integrating those goals with funding streams to make sure that, and holding agencies accountable for progress on the goals. So yes, the goals are and will be reflected over time in funding for each agency. Jonathan?
I'm just curious about what you read into the fact that you are raising taxes to the tune of nearly $1 trillion on upper income families. You have a lot of tax increases on multinational corporations, and yet you are doing some spending cuts, and yet you don't get the budget down to below 4% of GDP. Does that tell you that what does that tell you mathematically about the ability of President Obama to keep his pledge not to raise taxes on families under $250,000? What is the Commission's instructions on taxes below $250,000? And I'm also curious, you've got a debt burden of 77% of GDP by the end of the decade. Do you think the United States can handle that without courting a financial crisis?
Well, first, one of the reasons why, let me start with the first question. I think what that reflects actually is the depth of the medium-term deficits that, as I mentioned, reflected the environment that we faced even at the beginning of last year. You have to remember, $5.8 trillion because the 2001-2003 tax cuts and the Medicare prescription drug benefit were not subjected to pay-go. We're now saying they have to be subjected to pay-go. $2.5 trillion because of the economic downturn. We're taking steps to try to mitigate the economic downturn. We do face a substantial medium-term deficit problem, and what we have said is we put forward proposals to get us part of the way there. The Commission will have to get us the rest of the way there. We have been very clear about our stance on taxes and, frankly, on other spending proposals also. The Commission hasn't even been yet named. Let's let it do its work and see what it can come up with.
So
Jackie?
is that open? I mean, is it all things on the table with that Commission?
Again, we have been clear on our position on taxes, but we have to let the Commission, it hasn't even been formed yet. Let's let it do its work. Over here.
2 points of clarification. Could you just clarify once and for all, when the pledge to cut the deficit in half, are you taking, my memory is that it's a nominal number, that you'd be like half of 1.3 trillion. The number you've said was the deficit on the date the president took office. So does that mean 650 billion by fiscal year 2013? And if so, you haven't hit that in this budget. You're over that. And
That projected deficit was 9.2% of the economy in 2009. We hit 4.2% by 2013, so we're cutting the deficit more than in half as a share of the economy, which, as you know, is the way economists typically evaluate deficits.
Okay, and then the second one is on the 3-year freeze, when you had said would be held for that share of non-security spending to 447 billion. I was looking on table S4. I don't see that figure. It's some others. Can you sort of reconcile that?
Sure. If you look actually at the bottom of table S4, at the very bottom on page 152, it says memorandum funding for appropriated programs, non-security, and you see the 447 in 2010, and then we actually are below that in 2011 at 441, and then you continue the freeze, 446 in 2012 and 2013. And let me actually pause on this because there's been some misconception too. What's clear from that table is that you see in 2009 there is a bump up in spending in that category because of the Recovery Act, which again was necessary to a key part of moving from minus 5% to more than plus 5% on economic activity. As you can see, our freeze is not off of that higher base. Instead, is off of the base in 2010, which excludes the Recovery Act. So the argument that we sort of raise prices before putting something on sale is misleading. We are going off of a base that excludes that bump up. Way in the back.
What would you say to federal employees? Oh, I'm sorry. What would you say to federal employees who are slated to get an increase, but significantly lower than the increase in previous years? And also, the budget calls for the hiring of several hundred thousand workers over the next 4 years. In what areas or agencies do you think those people will be hired in?
Sure. First, federal employees will get a 1.4% increase in their salaries, which frankly I think to a lot of Americans sounds pretty good. It reflects a formula that is used to compute wage and salary increases and is lower than it's been in the past because inflation is lower than it has been in the past, and so follows from that observation. With regard to expansions in federal personnel, they have over the past couple years been disproportionately in the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Veterans Affairs. Some areas where we are expanding the workforce include the acquisition workforce. We have $500 billion, north of $500 billion in federal contracts. Over the past 8 or 9 years, those contracts have doubled in size. The acquisition workforce has stayed constant. It's not too hard to figure out that oversight of those contracts has not kept pace with what it should be. So we are investing in a variety of things to try to improve oversight of what the federal government buys, including cracking down on no-bid contracts, trying to bulk up on bulk purchases of goods and services, and also expanding the acquisition workforce so that we have better oversight of those contracts. Right here.
Both Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Boehner are saying that the Pentagon should be included in the spending freeze, and there is a great deal of waste in contracting. Why is defense off the table?
Well, we need to remember, first, defense is not off the table in terms of fiscal constraint, but in terms of inclusion in the freeze, we're at war, and we need to make sure that we adequately fund our troops while we are at war. That having been said, there is significant constraint that's being imposed under Secretary Gates' leadership. I'll give a couple examples. Last year at this time, we had proposed canceling the F-22 fighter jet. I think most of the people in the room at that time, which by the way was a different room, but that's okay, at the time thought that that was completely unrealistic, would never happen. We succeeded in not only canceling that, but also the presidential helicopter. This year, Secretary Gates has made it very clear that he doesn't think additional purchases of C-17 cargo aircraft or other programs, for example, the alternative engine for the F-35 fighter jet, are militarily necessary, and that we could do a better job by canceling those programs. We are going to be pursuing those kinds of efficiencies in the defense budget, even while making sure that our troops in the field are adequately funded.
And does the decision not to go to the moon not send the message to our rivals that we've given up?
Not at all. Let me be clear about what is happening at NASA. The Constellation program, which is over budget and behind schedule, was intended to do what we've already done, which is return a man or woman to the moon. We believe in the future of human spaceflight. We believe that NASA can inspire Americans and lead to scientific advances. So we do have actually a small budget increase for NASA. What we're saying is let's redirect that towards longer range R&D, advanced robotics, research and development, and find those new technologies that will actually allow us to go further in space and not just repeat what we've already done, especially in a program that is behind schedule and over budget. Way in the back there.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, Kevin Hall of McClatchy. I had a question on the bipartisan tax panel. In your past life, I think your institution certainly was involved in that, and they called for looking at two sacred cows, mortgage interest deductions, and employer-provided health care. Some of that's addressed a little bit in the health care bill. But looking forward as you start this bipartisan process, is something as sacred as that on the table?
Well, look, again, as I said before, we've put forward the proposals that we favor, both on the revenue side of the budget and the spending side of the budget. The commission is not yet even formed, and I think one of the important principles here is we have to respect the work of the commission and let it do its work, and that's what we intend to do. Lori?
Some advocates of the Fiscal Commission, while pleased that you all are going that direction, would like to see more from the administration in terms of starting to talk about the tough choices that are going to be necessary. Was there any consideration when you put the budget together to either paying for some of the extension of policies like the AMT or the Bush tax cuts, or not permanently extending them?
Well, again, we have $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction contained in this budget. And a lot of painful choices that are already that have already been put on the table, and that we've already discussed some of them. So, is more necessary? Sure, but we think that to get the rest of the way there and get the medium-term deficit down to where it needs to be requires a bipartisan process, and that's what we're pursuing.
Hi, Peter. About the mortgage deduction and the charitable deduction,
Yep.
Last year when that was proposed for this year, 2011, it seemed as though even among some Democrats on the Hill that there was considerable resistance to that idea, especially in a slow mortgage market or a slow housing market. Are you confident that you can get enough support in Congress for that? It seems as though that's one of the sacred cows that we've been talking about.
Well, again, let's be clear about what we're proposing. We're proposing to limit itemized deductions for the top, under the top 5% of taxpayers back to the rate that applied when Ronald Reagan was president. So I think it's important to put in context. Now, there's going to be lots of questions about the political economy of what can get enacted and what can't. And I would just again return to the point that last year, many people were skeptical that we would succeed in getting a lot of the terminations and reductions that we had put forward at that point. We're going to fight for the things that we put forward because we believe we need additional job creation now and significant deficit reduction in the out years. And I think that reflects the priorities that not only the president has put forward, but that make most sense for the economy as a whole.
Have there been conversations with the Hill on that specific provision?
There have been conversations with the Hill on lots of topics, not surprisingly. So let's go over here.
Hi, this is Lalit Shah from Press Trust of India. An hour ago, President spoke about the nation being at war. Can you give us a sense of your war spending, how much increase has been this year? And does it also include any common sense budgetary cut, which the President spoke about?
Yes, even war spending is subjected to the same scrutiny that the base defense budget and other spending is. For fiscal year 2011, we have put forward a proposal for $160 billion to finance the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's roughly level with the all-in cost for 2010. Way in the back.
Peter, you talked yesterday about a glide path. Mm-hmm. Can you discuss sort of the challenge of trying to turn the tap off in a gradual way so as not to kick the legs out from the recovery?
Yes. So as I mentioned, we face two substantial challenges: a jobs deficit, more than 7 million lost jobs since December 2007, and a fiscal deficit with large out-year deficits, 5% of the economy, even after the economy has recovered. One of the challenges is we need to get those deficits down in the future so that we don't choke off economic activity and job creation. But we want to make sure we don't do that too quickly, or we will repeat the mistakes of 1937. Remember what happened then when the economy was beginning to recover, the nation moved to consolidate the deficit too quickly, and you threw the economy back into recession. We don't want to do that. So what we're seeking is a fairly smooth path from roughly 10% of the economy today down to those levels that, say, at 4% of the economy by 2015, put us within shooting range of a fiscally sustainable path. And as I said, more will be necessary, which is why we're creating a fiscal commission. But we don't want to act too rapidly to bring down the deficit, because that would exacerbate the jobs deficit. And so we're trying to find this balanced approach in which we have a smooth glide path from 10% down to a more sustainable level. And I think that's what's reflected in this budget. Right here.
Thanks, Peter. Two quick questions. One, the president on Friday said he's read Paul Ryan's. Thanks. President on Friday said he's read Paul Ryan's budget proposal. Wondered, I'm assuming you've read it, wanted to know if that's the case. Wanted to know, in your words, what you think is the biggest difference between your plan, your vision, your way forward, and his. And second, could you answer Jonathan's question about the sustainability of the debt?
First, as I said, let me answer that first. One of the reasons we are creating a fiscal commission is to get the deficit over the medium term down to a level that has a stable debt to GDP ratio. And that is important. It also would be reflected in a balanced budget, excluding interest payments on the debt. So that's the first point. I would note, however, that for right now, in 2010, private borrowing has collapsed. Long-term interest rates on federal securities, so the 10-year interest rate remains below 4%. And the reason that that has happened is, in a sense, the U.S. Treasury is basically the last borrower left standing. In the severe economic downturn that we have been experiencing, that is exactly what should happen, because it helps to bolster the economy in the short run. The issue is that as you go out over time and private borrowing picks up, you want to make sure that you're getting ahead of the fiscal deficit problem so that you're not substantially crowding out private activity. So that's with regard to the first point. Now, with regard to Representative Ryan, I have a lot of respect for Mr. Ryan, and I have read the plan that he put forward. It is worthy to delve into that for a moment, because it provides a contrast. His plan succeeds in addressing our long-term fiscal problem, which is a significant accomplishment. But let's examine how he does that. He takes the Medicare program, and for those 55 and below, turns it into a voucher program so that individuals are on their own in the healthcare market, and the voucher does not keep pace with healthcare costs over time. So it is not surprising that if you shift dramatically, both in terms of risk and expected cost, obligations from the federal government onto individuals, you can reduce the projected cost. He introduces individual accounts, privatization, into Social Security. He has significant changes to the tax code that would provide large tax benefits to upper income households while shifting the burden onto middle and lower income households. He eliminates the tax preference that currently exists for employer-sponsored insurance. So it is worthy of pausing. He has put forward an interesting plan. There are many aspects of that that are worthy of further discussion and debate, but it is a dramatically different approach in which much more risk is loaded onto individuals, and in which the Medicare program in particular is dramatically changed from its current structure.
The president was supposed to receive tax reform recommendations in December, and that was delayed indefinitely. Is there a possibility that that could be folded into the fiscal commission's review, or is it just on the back burner?
I would imagine that it will be folded into the fiscal commission. I would imagine that, again, the commission will be examining a variety of things, including tax reform.
Hi, Catherine Lewis on assignment for the Fiscal Times. I was wondering if you can give a dollar value for the improvement in the economy and how that will affect the deficit. The 10% down to 5%, do you have a dollar figure for that?
Sure. I mean, there are various ways of calibrating that, but again, to repeat, economic recovery moves the fiscal deficit from 10% of the economy to 5% of the economy. Just to scale it for the sake of argument, the economy is roughly $15 trillion, so a 5% improvement would be about $750 billion.
And can you also, to follow up on the question about the federal labor force, some jobs are going to be created and some are taken away. Can you give us any sense of scale of the number of jobs at stake?
I'm sorry, with regard to what?
The federal labor force, the changes in the government hiring.
I don't have a set of projections. We could perhaps get back to you with the underlying assumptions. There has been an increase in the federal workforce over the past few years, which has been in the areas that I mentioned earlier, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Veterans Affairs, for example. Way in the back. I think this, we'll have time for one more question, so why don't we make this the last one?
Hi, Max Kakis from Federal News Radio. I'm wondering, Mr. Orszag, if this budget is reflective at this point of any of Mr. Zientz's efforts to try to improve performance management within the federal government? And if not, when would you hope to start to see the results of his efforts in performance management?
It absolutely does reflect the work of Jeff Zients, who, by the way, is the nation's first chief performance officer and also the deputy director for management at OMB, in a variety of ways. The federal government's going to spend nearly $80 billion on information technology. There are huge improvements that can be made and that are being made in the management of those IT investments, including, for example, a simple measure, the IT dashboard, where you can go online, click on individual IT projects, see whether they're behind schedule or not. It's already leading, for example, the Department of Veterans Affairs. It led them to cancel some IT projects that were just being poorly managed. One example. I already mentioned acquisition and reform of our acquisition workforce and contracting. That's another thing that the performance team has been working a lot on. Federal personnel and hiring. That team is working with the Office of Personnel Management to simplify and streamline the hiring process and also provide easier checkpoints so that those applying for federal jobs can check online to see what's happening. So in area after area after area, you see the work that has already begun in improving government performance feeding into the federal budget. So I think with that, I just wanted to thank everyone. If you have questions or first additional details, the President said, available on budget.gov. And I think our press folks are available if you have additional questions after this. Thank you very much.